The Book of Abraham is considered scripture by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They believe it contains the writings of the biblical figure Abraham that were lost to the world until Joseph Smith discovered some ancient Egyptian papyri. These papyri were part of a traveling Egyptian collection featuring some mummies and other artifacts. After examining the papyri, Joseph claimed that he could read the Egyptian hieroglyphics and discovered that they were the writings of Abraham and Joseph of Egypt. Joseph raised the 2,400 needed in order to buy the collection from his followers and began working on the translation of the papyri he claimed contained the writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt, called the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus. Wilford Woodruff recorded in his journal that Joseph the Seer has presented us some of the Book of Abraham, which was written by his own hand, but hid from the knowledge of man for the last 4,000 years, but is now come to light through the mercy of God. Today, the Church views the Book of Abraham as being a book of modern scripture and publishes it as part of the Pearl of Great Price, which is often bundled with the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. The introduction to the text reads, "The Book of Abraham, translated from the papyrus by Joseph Smith, a translation of some ancient records that have fallen into our hands from the catacombs of Egypt, the writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt, called the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus." There were 3 facsimiles that were part of the scroll. Joseph provided a translation of these facsimiles, and they are included as part of the book today. According to Joseph Smith, facsimile number 1 is a depiction of an attempted sacrifice of Abraham by an adulterous priest as described in the beginning of the text. The Book of Abraham refers to the image as being a visual depiction of the story recorded on the papyrus, specifically an attempt on Abraham's life. Joseph translated some of the depictions in facsimile number 2, but not most of them. The most interesting part, facsimile number 2, concerned the star Kolob. This supposedly is the closest star to the residence of God and governs the other 15 fixed stars and planets. Joseph said facsimile number 3 represented Abraham reasoning upon the principles of astronomy to Pharaoh's court, and Joseph identifies and names each of the people depicted in the facsimile. When Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham, there was no one in the Western Hemisphere who could yet read Egyptian. The Rosetta Stone had been discovered, but that knowledge had not yet crossed the Atlantic. After Joseph's death, the collection remained with his family until it was sold by Emma Smith to a museum in Chicago. It was apparently lost in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Fortunately, the facsimiles had been copied, published, and were available for study. The first such study was performed by M. Théodule de Verrier in 1860. De Verrier was able to decipher the names and titles of the various Egyptian gods and goddesses on the facsimiles, as well as the name of the deceased Egyptian for whom the scroll had been originally prepared. De Verrier identified the 3 facsimiles as common Egyptian funerary documents and concluded that Joseph's interpretation of the facsimiles was nonsense. Regarding facsimile number 3, he wrote, "The deceased led by Mat into the presence of Osiris. His name is Horus, as may be seen in the prayer which is at the bottom of the picture, and which is addressed to the divinities of the 4 cardinal points." In 1912, Reverend Franklin S. Spaulding sent copies of the 3 facsimiles from the Book of Abraham to some of the world's leading scholars of Egyptology. All 8 of the scholars that responded agreed that Joseph's translations were incorrect. Dr. Arthur Mace called it a pure fabrication, and that it was a clumsy imposture. Dr. Sayce referred to them as an impudent fraud, and that Joseph had ignorantly copied them. Dr. Flinders Petrie of London University observed that they were centuries later than Abraham, and that there is not a single word that was true in these explanations. Dr. Breasted stated that the facsimiles were well understood scenes and that Joseph's translation had no connections with what scholars knew about them. The Egyptologists all agreed that Joseph's interpretations of the facsimiles were incorrect. These were common funeral scenes whose meanings are well known, and that they did not exist until many centuries after the time of Abraham, and that they were not what Joseph said that they were. In 1967, some of the original papyri were discovered in the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art and given to the church. The most interesting surviving papyrus fragments contain facsimile number 1 and the significant amount of the scroll attached to it. These papyri have been examined and translated by Egyptologists. It was determined that these papyri are just ordinary funeral texts, the Book of Breathings and Book of the Dead. This is consistent with what Egyptologists said about the facsimiles for decades prior. In 1966, Joseph's Egyptian alphabet and grammar was found in the church archives. This document shows his working attempt to translate the Egyptian characters while producing the Book of Abraham. It included many characters that are on the recovered papyrus, even in the same order, and their corresponding translation. This is strong evidence that the recovered papyrus is the same one that Joseph used to produce the Book of Abraham. Examinations of this document show that Joseph's translations were completely inaccurate. The church has known about these problems since the 60s, but still teaches that Joseph translated the papyrus to get the Book of Abraham. Despite being raised in the church and its education system in the late 80s and 90s, I did not learn about any of these problems until I was confronted by an investigator while I was on my mission. The church has responded to these problems by proposing that it may have been taken from a different portion of the papyrus scrolls, or that instead of making a literal translation, he used the Urim and Thummim as a means of receiving revelation. An examination of the translation document shows the first of these apologetic responses to be invalid. Many of the characters from the recovered fragments match those in Smith's notes that he attributes to the text, and in the same sequence. Facsimile number 1 in the Book of Abraham matches the one in the papyri. So it is evident that the recovered papyrus was part of the scroll used by Joseph as the source of the Book of Abraham. The second fails because the Book of Abraham contains Smith's translation of facsimile number 1 that's included in the papyri. Abraham 1:12 specifically refers to facsimile number 1. If it wasn't a literal translation, why does the Book of Abraham show and reference it? Besides, Joseph himself claimed to use the papyrus scroll as his source, and that claim is still made in the introduction to the book. Joseph's journal repeatedly mentions the work as a translation of the Egyptian characters. However, the real proof that Joseph was trying to translate the characters is in facsimile number 3. Joseph says that figure 2 is King Pharaoh, whose name is given in the characters above his head. He says that figure 4 is Prince of Pharaoh, King of Egypt, as written above the hand. He states that figure 5 is Shulam, one of the king's principal waiters, as represented by the characters above his hand. While all of those are wrong, figures 2 and 4 are clearly women just for starters. That's beside the point. Joseph specifically mentions the character in the facsimile, and explicitly states what they say. It cannot be any clearer than this. Joseph was trying to translate the characters on the papyrus in a literal way. He said he could do this through his connection with the divine. What does the fact that he got every single aspect of his translation wrong say about his claimed divine connection? The church now admits that there is no mention of Abraham on the papyrus or the facsimiles, that they're just standard funerary text, and that they did not exist till long after the time of Abraham. Their position now is that the veracity and value of the Book of Abraham cannot be settled by a scholarly debate concerning the book's translation and historicity. Of course it can. This is blatantly dishonest on the part of the church. By having a large portion of the source document and the facsimiles that were a part of it, along with Joseph's translation of each of them and his working translation documents, we have ample evidence of his ability to read and translate Egyptian. This allows us to directly measure the veracity and value of the Book of Abraham. If Joseph was correct, or at least in the ballpark, the church would tout that as strong evidence in his prophetic abilities. The only reason they are discouraging scholarly debate is that they know that the evidence is not in their favor. The church's essay on this topic goes on to say that the book's status of Scripture lies in the eternal truths it teaches and the powerful spirit it conveys. And Joseph's translation was not a literal rendering of the papyri, as in a conventional translation would be. Rather, the physical artifacts provided an occasion for meditation, reflection, and revelation. Why is the book now teaching that the Book of Abraham is something other than what Joseph said it was? That it was produced in a different way than he said he did it? They have completely abandoned his claim that the papyrus contained the writings of Abraham written by his own hand. Why did they change their position? The church is now saying that the content of the text is what's important, and not the messy details of how it came about. However, the content of the Book of Abraham is a problem. The gods Joseph explicitly names, Elkanah, Limba, Mamachra, and Korash, do not exist in any ancient pantheon. Joseph's translation of figure 5 in facsimile 2 claims that the sun, moon, and stars borrow their light from Kolob through an interstellar medium. That is something we know to be false. Everywhere we can test the cosmological claims of the Book of Abraham, we find they do not match up with proven science. For instance, there is no such thing as a fixed star or planet in space. That concept does not make any sense in our expanding universe. In addition, there are many anachronisms in the text. The term Chaldeans did not exist until the 9th century, 1,000 years after the time of Abraham. The term Pharaoh was not used until the mid-18th dynasty, which is 500 years after the time of Abraham. It was never used as a name, and it meant great house, not king by royal blood. The content of the Book of Abraham is truly a farrago of nonsense. Doctrinally, the Book of Abraham was the source for much of the racism that existed in the church before 1978. It was used to justify banning black people from being full participating members because of their race, which was cursed by God. This was an evil and racist doctrine that still hangs over the church today. All of the evidence proves that the papyrus is not what Joseph and the church claimed it to be. If it was, it would be one of the greatest historical discoveries ever made. All of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity would be studying it, and it would have transformed the beliefs and lives of billions of people. However, no one outside of the church takes it seriously, and even the church has been forced into a position in which they don't exactly know what it is anymore. What does the failure of Joseph's translation of the papyri say about his motivations? It's demonstrable he could not read the hieroglyphics, and he had to know that. By claiming that he had the gift to translate ancient languages when he could not, he knowingly lied to the people who gave him the money to buy the collection in the first place. This makes the Book of Abraham a fraud and Joseph Smith a demonstrable fraudster.